And we're back. We have Katrina Piercy. Katrina, for people that aren't familiar with you, can you give us kind of a background on yourself and your current kind of roles and responsibilities?
Sure. First off, thanks so much for having me on today. I am in the Office of Disease Prevention and Health Promotion, an office that you may not have heard of, but probably have heard of a lot of our work. So I am an exercise physiologist and a registered dietitian by training. And with this background, I'm heavily involved with its development and the implementation of national policy for nutrition, so the dietary guidelines for Americans, as well as on the physical activity side, so the physical activity guidelines for Americans. And so I get to be involved in pulling together all of the research and the latest science, and then how does that translate into policy, as well as how do we message and communicate around those topics so that we can help Americans have healthier lives.
And I found your name through one of the papers that you were the lead author on, the 2019 or 2018 piece on the physical activity guidelines for the Americans, for Americans. And I reached out because you're probably one of the best people to talk to about this topic. So let's just dive right into framing the physical activity guidelines for adults. Can you give what those are, and then we can go further into them?
Sure. So to back up, why we set these physical activity guidelines. And so the ones that you're pointing to that we released in 2018 were actually the second edition that we've put those out. And basically what we do to develop guidelines is take a multi-year process to look at all of the science of physical activity and health outcomes, and looking at all of that together to say, okay, what are the amounts and types of physical activity that we need to get and stay healthy? And so the guidelines come out with these quantitative recommendations and say, okay, for optimum health, here's where we'd like people to be. So for adults specifically, the goal is 150 to 300 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity per week, plus 2 days a week of strength training. Now that's moderate intensity. If you're doing vigorous intensity, we have like a 2-to-1 ratio on that. So if you like to run or do more higher intensity activities, 1 minute of vigorous is roughly equivalent to 2 minutes of moderate. So you could meet the guidelines of 150 to 300 minutes in 75 to 150 minutes or so as another option, or any combination of that. But that is really kind of the target that we would like people to be working towards. Of course, there's lots of benefits if you're even nowhere near that starting point. But ideally, that's kind of the framework and what we measure off of when we talk about people meeting the guidelines. That's what we're working towards.
And most of our audience is clinicians or students going into rehab professions. And a lot of times we're trying to promote these guidelines with our patients and across the community, and trying to get individuals to understand what is moderate, what is vigorous aerobic activity, what is muscle strengthening. Can we provide maybe some more clarity on what those terms mean? So maybe we start at moderate kind of aerobic exercise.
Yeah.
How do individuals know what that is and if they're achieving that?
Yeah, what counts? So there's an actually really easy way to do this. We use what we call the talk test. And so ideally, if you're doing an activity, you want your heart beating a little bit. So we're moving a little bit more. So this is a step up from light. And walking, the walk, jog, run, continuing tends to be one that's easy to kind of use this as an example. But if you are doing something moderate intensity, your heart's beating a little faster, you can still be talking and maybe carrying on a conversation as you're doing that. And so that's equivalent to, think about a brisk jog. So this isn't a stroll, would be more on a light intensity. A lot of the evidence is when you get into the moderate level. So that's more of a brisk walk. If you are unable to say more than a few words, so we're getting into more vigorous, that would be kind of a sign of vigorous. Now, if you're a runner, and you're used to running and talking, that's how I socialize. So my body has adapted to do that. And so I can get in more than a few words, but I'm running at a more vigorous, the heart's moving, things like that. But for a lot of people, if walking, it might be something you're doing, thinking about kind of the speed at which you're walking to put you into moderate, and then like moving into that jog or that run would be in a vigorous side.
And then the 2 times per week of muscle strengthening, what can people conceptualize as muscle strengthening activity?
So muscle strengthening is any times that we're using our muscle contracting against a force, like basic physiology there. So there's lots of different ways that muscle strengthening works. A lot of people tend to think of Muscle strengthening is I need to be in a gym with equipment, with weights. That all counts. So if you're using dumbbells, if you're using machines, if you're using pulleys, great. It also could be body weight, squats, push-ups, planks, things like that. It could be resistance bands. It could be gallons of water. It could be cans. It could be books. Lots of different things. And it counts whether you are doing it specifically for the purpose of strengthening your muscles. So you're trying to do a workout on that, or it might be shoveling snow, for example. There's some forms of yoga and some of those exercises that are going to count as muscle strengthening as well. If you are carrying your groceries, I always tell people to see what they can fit into a cart and try carrying that around. You'll probably get out of the store faster, and you'll get to muscle strengthening in too. So a lot of things count within this, and much more than I think people tend to think about. We have a very limited focus. A lot of people think of exercise that it must be in the right environment, wearing the right clothes, picking up the right pieces of equipment. But a lot of things that we do every day, chores, playing with kids, can count within this as well.
And with the aerobic guidelines, it's time dependent, or 150 to 300, or that 75, or somewhere combined. With the resistance training, is just 2 days per week. Are there more clear kind of delineations on what that actually should look like from a volume, intensity, et cetera perspective?
So they don't get so prescriptive into like a fit principle per se. And part of that really depends on the person. So ideally you're doing it at least twice a week and you're working all major muscle groups. And so that's kind of the starting point of this. And then there's an opportunity for tailoring. And so a lot of the audience members that may be listening to this do this type of work. If they're working with an individual, to then say, okay, what are your goals and what are we working towards? And then that might necessitate adjusting, what types of muscle strengthening activity that somebody is doing and how that might look. But the guidelines itself, because these are public health guidance. So this is trying to set the recommendations and the targets kind of for big picture public health and these overall outcomes. And so it doesn't get into specifically muscle strengthening for if you want to be faster, for example, or if you're working on this sport, or if you're, just trying to maintain bone strength and functional ability as you age.
And then those are the adult guidelines. With either the aerobic or the muscle strengthening, do they have to be progressive in nature? So does there have to be more intensity over time, or does the load for muscle strengthening have to increase, or is it just they need to hit these timelines, these general muscle groups, and there's not a ton of evidence we have that it has to be progressive?
So ideally, yes, if I'm putting on my exercise physiology hat, that like you want to be doing activities that, will continue to challenge you and that will also be interesting and something you enjoy doing. So that's a big piece of this too. Most Americans are not meeting the physical activity guidelines, the aerobic or the muscle strengthening. If you put them both together, the numbers are even lower. And so for a lot of people, you need to find something that's fun and engaging. And so if you're doing the same thing every day, for some people, that's great. Morning walk, and this is what I'm doing. I got my loop. Perfect. Great. But for others, that might get boring and repetitive. And so changing it up, taking a different route, picking up a different weight, trying a different muscle group, that can help provide some stimulation and engagement. And that might help keep you in this larger. But if we think about this from a public health sense, the guidelines themselves don't get so prescriptive. And we kind of leave that up for health professionals that are working with individuals to really help navigate and set up a program that would work for that individual. So that's where exercise physiologists, personal trainers, physical therapists really come in to say, okay, where are we now? And what are your goals? And how do we work towards helping you get there?
Does someone's occupation count within these parameters or guidelines, or is it outside of their job demands?
So at this point in the guidelines, the evidence that we have now is that any physical activity is kind of counting towards that. So that might be occupational physical activity, that might be commuting, that might be things you're doing day to day, that all kind of add up. And that's part of what we're trying to frame the messaging around, of that it all does add up. And you might not even realize that, if you take the stairs coming into, if you're working in an office, taking the stairs up, you're getting some activity. If you're parking a little farther away, to walk into an office or to run your errands or things like that. Occupational physical activity is also something we're starting to look at a little bit more to see how that interplays with overall benefits of physical activity. And that's something we're about to embark on the next edition of the physical activity guidelines. And there's some emerging evidence looking at occupational physical activity, and perhaps if there's a paradox there with do individuals that do high volume occupational physical activity get those same benefits? And that's an example of a topic and why we regularly look at all the science every 10 years to say, wow, is everyone getting those same benefits? And how do we want to make sure the messages go out?
Can you touch on what are the benefits of hitting these guidelines?
The benefit list is very long. And so part of what we try to do is figuring out kind of what benefits might resonate with individuals. One thing that was great when we did the second edition of the guidelines is that we added to this list. So there's a lot that you would think of like, okay, I should be physically active because it'll reduce my risk for heart disease, type 2 diabetes, hypertension. We also know that that's not necessarily motivating for people to say, wow, if I do this now, maybe in 20 years, I will have a lowered risk for this. So there's been a lot more research also looking at some of these acute benefits. So things that could happen right away and framing those as ways to help encourage people to get moving today because you might feel better, reduce risk of depression, anxiety, you might sleep better. Your blood pressure could come down that day and better insulin sensitivity. So there's both benefits from like right now, if you're doing it today, and also kind of cumulative over time in terms of almost all of the health outcomes we could think about from cancer to cardiovascular disease. Then we think about things like bone health, muscle strengthening, fall risk as you get older. So really the benefits continue to grow about why physical activity is a good thing. And a lot of those benefits start to come in before you get to the guidelines recommendations. So you get the biggest bang for your buck if we can get people into that 150 to 300 minute range. But the real biggest bang comes from doing nothing and then doing something. So that's the message that I always try to put in of even if you're, 150 seems like a big number. And where do I get started? But if you've got 5 minutes today, if you've got 10 minutes, some of these things can really start to add up and come in early. And that might help you encourage you to do it a little bit more once you see some of those benefits.
Are these guidelines different for adolescent age children, younger than this adult population, and then the older adult population on those two ends of the age spectrum? What changes?
Yeah, so we have guidelines set up for a couple different age groups. We have some guidance for kids younger than age 6. The evidence is still growing in that area there, but kind of that preschool age. The adolescent teen youth age is 6 to 17. And so for them, we want 60 minutes of moderate intensity aerobic activity each day, including 3 days of muscle strengthening, bone strengthening, and vigorous activity. Again, this might feel like a big number, but this is, and it's more than the adult guidelines if you do the math on that. But a lot of the things that kids are already doing would count towards this. So this is things like playing at school, at PE, at recess, playing sports, kind of running around, general movement and things. It doesn't mean kids necessarily need to be in a gym. They could be as they get older, but a lot of the things, climbing trees, hopping, skipping, throwing, all of these physical literacy skills that kids should be developing, there's tremendous benefit if they're moving their bodies every day. Then we move into into adults. So youth is considered 6 to 17. Adults is 18 and older. For older adults, we actually have the same guidelines as the adult ones, the 150 to 300 minutes moderate intensity aerobic, 2 days of strength training, with some caveats. For older adults, we particularly want them to think about incorporating multi-component physical activity. And so what this is exercises that are going to incorporate aerobic, muscle strengthening, and balance, because we're particularly concerned about fall risk. And so thinking about activities that might pull in 2 out of those 3 types of exercises, things like ballroom dancing, if they're doing, a bicep curl, maybe with a water bottle or a dumbbell, could they stand on one foot? So you're incorporating a balance piece into that. because we know the falls risk is higher for older adults. Although if older adults are physically active, they have a lower risk for falls and a lower risk of the extent of injury for falls. There's also some messaging with older adults of being as active as you are able to be. And this goes to the same with individuals who may have a disability or coming back from an illness. Yes, we know the benefits if we can get somebody to that 150-minute threshold. But if that is not in the picture for you, as active as you are physically able to be, really can bring in a lot of benefits. And we start to see other benefits, particularly with older adults who may have a chronic condition, in terms of reduced risk of the kind of condition coming to start with, also the progression of that, as well as symptoms, things like osteoarthritis and things that actually feels counterintuitive, but there's benefits of being physically active to help with symptom management.
And are these U.S. national guidelines significantly different than the World Health Organization guidelines or international guidelines, or are they very similar?
We're actually quite aligned on guidelines. And we do that intentionally because it can confuse people if we're looking at things differently, but also we're all looking at pretty much the same body of literature that is feeding into this work. When we do a round of the guidelines, we did a massive 2-year project to look at all of the scientific literature. And so a lot of the stuff that we look at the United States is the same as what the WHO is looking at. So for example, last time their guidelines, ours came out in November of 2018, theirs came out in November of 2020. And they literally took all of the evidence and all of the reviews that we had done in the United States and added on to them a little bit for their work and developed their guidelines. And we're actually coordinating with them now and talking with other countries about how do we line things up as we move into this next edition. Because one, we don't want to confuse the message. We don't want to reinvent the wheel. And we want to be able to cover as many topics as possible. And so if we share some of this work and some of these reviews and align efforts, then we only strengthen what we know about the physical activity research area.
In the US, those 3 kind of age ranges, youth, adult, older adult, what is the current evidence for how many people are hitting either the combined guidelines or the aerobic or just the strengthening? And then is there information on how that compares to other countries?
Yeah. So when we look I'll answer your question a few different ways. Big picture, kind of overall, if we put everybody together, it's about 25% overall who are meeting both the aerobic and the muscle strengthening component. If you look at kids, for example, they tend to be doing a little bit more of the muscle strengthening activity only because the nature of the way kids play, they tend to get in a little bit more muscle strengthening. They're not necessarily taking long walks the way an adult may be doing or an older adult. But if you combine those two together, especially in teens, the rates are even a little lower, closer to 20%. For adults in general, we have higher rates of meeting the aerobic side. So about 50% are meeting the aerobic activity. There's lower numbers meeting muscle strengthening. So you combine that, that's where it comes down. Older adults in particular have the lowest rates of meeting the guidelines. So if you look by decade, that's when we see that trending down. And that's particularly why we actually focused on them. Last year, we put out a report on strategies to increase physical activity among older adults, and particularly focused on what works, what are some of the barriers that are unique to this population, and what are some changes that could be done by different levels of society, and whether that's a built environment or healthcare providers or others that could support older adults to be more active. We track all of this through Healthy People, which sets national objectives every decade. And so there are Healthy People objectives for meeting the physical activity guidelines, and then you can stratify by age, by gender, by race, ethnicity, socioeconomic status, household income, education level, and be able to kind of see where some of these disparities are. Because overall, we aren't doing great, but particularly when you start looking at some different populations, we're doing quite poor. And that's likely due to a number of different barriers that people may experience that make it challenged to be active. In terms of us in other countries, pretty similar. Unfortunately, a lot of us are not at a great point. There's definitely bright spots in different cities that may have a different culture of being more active and riding more bikes or walking And so there's different pockets that may look different, but I think collectively, there's an opportunity for us all to be more active.
That initial number you gave, a percentage, 25%, and then the others, how are those measured? And are those potentially higher than they actually are? Are they self-reported? How are they measured?
Self-report. At this point, it's self-reported data. So anything that feeds into Healthy People, it's a national representative data set. And so we do that so that we can really be able to look and then be able to slice and parse down and say, okay, within this population, to be able to make these kind of comparisons. That's a newer area in physical activity as we're starting to see more data with wearable devices and step counts and trying to compare some of these pieces. A lot of them are fairly similar, that we're still at lower rates than we would like to be. But it also does pick up other pieces. When you do a pedometer or a Fitbit or an Apple Watch or something like that, it's picking up within those steps. It's also picking up light intensity activity. And so that's another part that we're looking at, within the guidelines. At this point, a lot of the evidence of benefits is hitting that moderate to vigorous threshold. And so steps might show you that you have a number of steps, and it might be a large majority of those are light activity. But it also could show you that, hey, you're getting in some incidental physical activity of walking through the grocery store or, doing errands or things like that, which, depending on how vigorous you might be moving, you could be getting some of those benefits as well. So that's another part that I see us kind of growing into of how wearable devices can inform meeting the guidelines and kind of some of the recommendations that might come in around those.
Has that percentage, that low percentage, changed much over the past few decades? How long have you all been tracking this in the US? And then can we then discuss why are they so low and what are some of these big barriers?
Yeah. So we've been tracking these for a little while now. The data has changed a little bit. One big change, and this is how kind of the data connect or kind of the surveillance measures connect to guidelines. With the second edition of the guidelines, we removed a 10-minute bout requirement. So when the guidelines first came out in 2008, one of the recommendations for adults, not kids, was you need to do activity in at least 10-minute bouts. And so the idea was, so these little quick jaunts, or you take the stairs, or you walk over to someone's desk instead of sending an email, didn't get you, if you didn't get up to 10 minutes, it didn't start counting. And so when the advisory committee came in to help inform the second edition, we said, let's review this and see if this is actually still true. And so there was evidence that there's benefits for a minute, much lower than that 10-minute bout. Well, that then had to change the survey question that we asked about meeting the guidelines, because before we were asking in bouts of at least 10 minutes, how many minutes are you active, how many days a week, and things like that. So we had to adjust things a little bit. And so that changes kind of how people might report on that. Also knowing it's self-report, which can be tricky sometimes to remember all of these pieces. And so there's a lot of data now where people are starting to take a self-report or kind of a daily snapshot of what you may be doing and marry that with a wearable device and be able to get a better picture of what they might be doing or how much activity. So we've been tracking this, although this is still a newer area relatively, that we've been really focused on and kind of realizing how much benefits there are and how we need to be measuring this so we know where we are. In terms of why is this so low, there's a lot of barriers to this. There's a lot of misperceptions as well. A lot of the work that we did around communicating for the guidelines, we developed our Move Your Way communications campaign. And so the guidelines are actually written for policymakers and health professionals and kind of that audience. It's technical. It's not as technical as the advisory committee report, which is very science heavy and graphs and figures. But the policy document is that, a policy document. And so not for the lay consumer to pick up. So we created a whole suite of resources. There's over 80 right now in English and Spanish. And it kind of translates that guidelines from 150 minutes. How do you break this down? The first thing the comms team was said to me is, Katrina, 150 doesn't test well. Can we have a new number? I was like, well, no, the science is that you guys had to figure out how do we communicate that? How do we meet people where we are? Because if you tell someone who's not been active before, okay, here's the guidelines, 150 minutes a week, their eyes will glaze over. So, and for people that don't regularly have time for that, time is probably the number one barrier across the board of how do we fit this in? So a lot of what is in the messaging for Move Your Way of like, do you have 5 minutes? Do you have 10 minutes? Are there things that you could be doing already within your normal day that, gosh, you may not have realized have counted, or activities that you could walk to run an errand, or, take a basket and do a brisk walk through the grocery store. And then you're doing your errands, you're getting some activity, other ways to kind of break that down. Time is a big one. The perception that it needs to be exercise. We use the term physical activity. That's the only term that's in the guidelines. And when we talk about it, because people still have the mentality of exercise, which means I have to be sweating, I need the right equipment, I need to be wearing the right thing, I may need to be in the right location for this. And that feels overwhelming and comes with some costs as well. And some knowledge of like, I don't know where to start. So we try to frame this as something that's fun, that's enjoyable, that's accessible. If you are comfortable walking, putting on a pair of shoes and taking a walk, but knowing for a lot of people that might not be a safe option. And so we can't just say, put on some tennis shoes and take a walk around your neighborhood. For many people, they don't have a neighborhood that perceived or real may be safe for them. So that's another piece of how does this fit in? And then depending on what someone's work environment may be, what does day-to-day look like? The thought of adding in something feels overwhelming. And so a lot of actually what we did in the mid-course report for older adults was looking at some of the policies and systems and what could be changed in the built environment that could support an active community for everybody that might interact with that, whether that's sidewalks or, lights to cross the street that are long enough that someone can safely get across, connecting streets to one another so that you could walk from one place to another. But it's a challenge. And for a lot of people requires some individualization of like what's going on in your life at this phase of life where you can find ways to put in physical activity, because it might work. And a few months later, life changes or the weather changes or, who knows what else might come in. But it for many people, it's hard to factor in every day.
You said those resources, it's on Move Your Way. Is that a website? Yes. Or how can individuals access those?
Yes. So everything is up on our website. It's off of our health.gov is our main website that has all of the physical activity guidelines. So if you want the science, the policy, as well as there's a microsite that has Move Your Way resources, and they are for kids, for parents, for adults, for older adults, for individuals who are pregnant and postpartum. We spent a lot of time testing the messages with those populations to kind of say, okay, does this resonate? Like, would this be motivating? Like, do you see yourself in some of these images? Really trying to help make sure that this was tailored to each person. And so with the idea that this would be something they would, see and be able to, okay, here's some of the benefits that this is why this might be important for me. Or this is maybe how I could help fit this in.
With some of these campaigns over the years and promoting of the guidelines, what have you all found has worked well and pushed things in potentially a positive direction and gained traction, and what has gone potentially poorly or just kind of fell flat?
So one of the probably most successful physical activity campaigns was Verb, which was a CDC campaign back in the early 2000s, catered to tweens. The tagline was Verb, it's what you do. It was a multi-million-dollar campaign that had significant funding behind it to really test it and research it and really create a national push for this. And unfortunately, as many campaigns tend to go, when there wasn't any more funding, a lot of that programming ended. And so that's been a continual challenge in the physical activity space of kind of trying to figure out how to put that in and get people to use it or kind of talk about physical activity or frankly, just put it into their day. We shifted a lot of our messages in COVID of, hey, here's some benefits of physical activity for mental health, for example, and here's ways that you might be able to connect with others, even while you might not be physically with them. And we've, I think, tried different ways to figure out how to make the sell of physical activity, and are still working to have that resonate. We know that telling people, hey, you might not have heart disease in 20 years, it's not necessarily a motivating factor. But we have a ton of evidence about, some of these acute benefits of feeling better now, mental health pieces, national security pieces of why we need to be more active as a nation. And I think we are still trying to get there and really get this information out there. But I think there's a lot of opportunity to figure out, how do we engineer it into our days? How are there opportunities within the school day, for example, for kids, or depending on where people work, if there's ways to encourage active breaks through work, that could be ways to put it in, because everyone's quite busy and it's hard to do.
Are there pockets of the US or specific regions that are known to have the least amount of adherence to these guidelines? And is it for specific reasons like lower socioeconomic status, lack of resources to outdoor play and exercise and activity? What have you all found within the states?
Yeah, there's definitely variability within that, and definitely a lot of it depends on the built environment, kind of what is there. The American College of Sports Medicine does do a fitness index and rates kind of the fittest cities, and some of the factors that factor into a fittest city is having environments that are encouraging people to be outside, that sidewalks and places to walk, to run, to roll. Things like that does make it easier, because that's a big piece. Like, yes, you can also walk circles and do loops inside an apartment, but that might only last so long. And so if you don't have a place to actually go and move, for many people, they may not be able to sustain physical activity longer term. So for a lot of people, that is a factor. Climate's a big one too. And so being in temperatures that are comfortable enough to be outside, or finding the time of day that you could get out to do something if you're going to be physically active outside. So again, this goes back to finding different ways that might work, because there's lots of things, there's lots of apps and different things where you could do, a class from your phone or from your computer or from your TV. And it's people just figuring out how that might fit in, and if that's something that they would find enjoyable.
What, if you're allowed to talk on it, what are the things that are going to be changing or updated for the third edition?
So we're in the phase now of looking at where are some of the new areas and what may have evolved since the last one. So one of the things that we had the committee do is give the research recommendations and help inform the research community of where are some gaps that they want it to go. So there's a whole section in their scientific report, section G, of here's their gaps. And so we're starting with that and kind of saying, okay, what are some of those gaps? Have we filled them? Do we have evidence on some of these areas? And then what are some newer areas? For example, something we didn't look at last time would be immune function. We didn't have data on that. And we now have data on physical activity and COVID-19 outcomes, and physical activity and the flu, which was an area that we didn't have 10 years ago when we were starting the last round. So that's one we're looking at. I mentioned the physical activity paradox that we're starting to look at. Things like, where can we grow with more evidence around mental health, as that is a really important topic that a lot of Americans struggle with. And is there more evidence about potential benefits for physical activity, either from reducing the risk, kind of overall mood, well-being, and also someone that may have depression or anxiety, how does physical activity fit in to support them with this? So we're in that process now of kind of looking at some of those different topics, kind of casting this wide net of what this may be. And then we would be narrowing down that list and putting out a call for nominations to serve on the committee as we start to think about what are some of the expertise that would feed into this work.
Do you all have a timeline on when that third edition will come out?
So we put out the last one in 2018. So if we stay on our 10-year cycle, that would put us at 2028. So we're looking at about 4 years from now.
And because these guidelines are broad and there's so much potential autonomy and variability in how each individual can make it work for their life. And like you said, there's so much benefit to moving towards those minimums or guidelines, and people should feel empowered to know that there's still substantial benefit if they're even far below those guidelines, because it's all relative to where they're starting. Do you have any other recommendations for therapists, providers, trainers, people that are having these day-to-day interactions with humans and patients on better strategies to communicate this information? Because I think probably one of the worst things is just blankly telling them the guidelines and almost enforcing it as this is what you have to do. And a lot of just telling people what to do doesn't help. And that's not really, positive messaging, and it probably doesn't change their behaviors. Do you have any practical recommendations for people having these discussions?
Absolutely. First, and I think it's wonderful that they have these discussions, because a lot of this comes from the conversation one-on-one or even in a group setting of kind of meeting people where they are. I mentioned there's a laundry list of all of the benefits for physical activity. But if you don't spend some time to get to know a person and figure out what might be their why or why they might be doing it, we know from doing a lot of research studies that we can get anyone into an exercise program and we can put them on a protocol and they can follow, an exercise program. If we've supervised them, we've given them the structure, they'll follow along and do it. But we want to talk about this as a long-term maintenance, that this is just part of their lifestyle. Like, this is what we do. We move our bodies every day. It's what I tell my kids, like, pick a sport, pick an activity, like every day your body needs to move and it functions better. But talking to somebody to figure out what might be of interest to them, is there a family history of a chronic condition that they might be worried about? Are they not sleeping great? Are they a little worried that their blood pressure is edging up? So figuring out where people are, that they might then, it might resonate better of like, here's some of these benefits of the why. And then saying, okay, what does your day look like? What does life look like right now? How does this fit in, like, reasonably? Because we come in and say, here's the guidelines. So this means, you need to take a 30-minute walk on this day, and you need to do this on this day. You need to do that on another day. That's not going to work. And so how do we help navigate that for somebody and help kind of figure out what is your day and then say, where does it fit in? So within Move Your Way, we have a Move Your Way activity planner, and you could actually sit with someone and be like, okay, let's map out a week. Like, what are you doing? And even things like, all right, great. Are you doing a bunch of chores on, Saturday morning? Maybe the family's helping out and you're vacuuming and dusting and doing great. That counts. There's physical activity. You can add that in. And so spending some time up front to kind of help somebody fit it in. I think that's the biggest challenge for a lot of people. This is an app on top of things. Or can you figure out how to multitask it? Could you take a walking meeting at work? Is there a way to do errands by foot or by bike or, things like that? So I think any health professionals working with an individual, taking some time to get to know them and figure out what might resonate with them is going to be your best bet.
Yeah, I've spent countless therapy sessions literally just with pen and paper, sitting down next to a patient, brainstorming what does a typical day look like for you, or a typical week, and let's start experimenting with options, and that feels realistic for you. And what either do you need or want to get back to, or what do you want to experiment with? And it's kind of just a trial period. And I try to make it as like low threat as possible, in the sense that if they don't achieve our initial plan, that's okay, because we have so many other ways that we can work through this. And maybe it was too much of a starting point and you felt like it was unapproachable. So I think just that practicality of knowing them more, understanding how to realistically fit it in, and then to go from there and to have it be kind of a trial and error throughout interactions.
Yeah. And the other thing to consider too is that it's really important to start slow and build this up. So the other end of the spectrum that tends to happen is somebody sees this and are like, oh my gosh, I should be doing this. Or maybe the doctor mentioned something and, they got worried about something and I'm going to go start. I'm like, okay, I'm going to go run 5 miles today. And we end up setting these really big goals. And then what happens is it hurts. It's uncomfortable. You might get injured. And, all of that energy and enthusiasm might completely be gone in a day or two because you might have jumped in too fast. And there's the benefit of, a health professional kind of working with you, a coach, a therapist, somebody that's kind of walking with, and it's like, okay, you want to run a 5K? Great. Let's map out a plan and let's help you build up and get to it. And it will feel a lot better because for a lot of people too, the idea of physical activity, one, they think immediately to exercise and they think of pain. This no pain, no gain mentality is still very much there. And trying to reframe this like, no, this could be fun. This could be out dancing. This could be playing tag with your kids. And this could be you building this up so that you get to a point where maybe that 5 miles feels pretty good. But if you're just starting out, pretty much for no one is it going to feel good at that point. So that's where having somebody with you can be really important.
Yeah, I've noticed that as well with patients who try to have these very fast and drastic weight loss changes through unhealthy means of either, not the best dietary approaches or just things where they're trying to just get it over with quickly. And then there's no long-term goal in mind, or there's no plan of how is this sustainable long-term. And I think that goes for physical activity as well of, you can have a short-term rushed plan. That's a lot of things, but one, like you said, there's potential risk to that. And it's not looking at the big picture of how is this sustainable over someone's life.
Yeah. We want to change a lifestyle, not necessarily a short-term piece. And yes, the same thing happens with, I'm going to clean out all the cupboards and I'm not going to touch any of this. And then it becomes, the mentality is then you're in this very restricted, I'm going to do this for this amount of time. Instead of thinking like, how do I recenter, refocus my life so that physical activity is just a part of what I do and what I am. And how does that fit in? Not as like, to go do this, but like, hey, I get to go move, I get to go take a walk or a jog with a friend, or what are ways that I could put this into what I'm already doing, and then I start getting some of these benefits.
Is there anything else that you want to touch on that we haven't already discussed before we wrap it up, Katrina?
I think we've covered all of the things. I think the big thing is just to find something that you enjoy doing. Like, this really should be a fun experience. For many people getting started, it's not, for a variety of reasons. And I think having a health professional with you that can help navigate that and support you in that, because it takes some time to kind of find something, or even finding the right activity that works for you that might kind of meet where you are. Is really important. But there's just tremendous benefits of a physical active lifestyle. Whether or not you get all the way to the guidelines, that would be great. But if you would just get moving, if you've got 5 or 10 minutes, even if you're listening to this podcast here, you could be walking. I like to tell people when I give talks and I'm on Zoom and they can see me, I'm like, you could be doing push-ups. You could do a plank. You could walk around the house. You could be doing other little things. So if we think about kind of reducing this down to small bites, and something more manageable, those really can add up.
Awesome. We'll include all those links and the resources you mentioned in the show notes for clinicians to provide to patients, or anyone listening to this that they can find themselves. We'll call it there.
Perfect.
Thank you so much, Katrina.
Thanks so much.